All right, thanking God for, among other things, the opportunities to make corrections or at least clarifications. Understanding that as I progressed through our discussion of chapter 5, I made it clear that justification is a thing that is talked about in the past tense, meaning it is one of the things that is associated with the fact that Christ died and therefore we have been justified. However, it opens the door to a process that leads to eternal life. And so, as we mentioned in the last chapter, justification is a part of a process. And just because we have been justified, it does not mean that everything that God describes related to our salvation or eternal life is finished. And that sets the stage for chapter 6, where he is going to deal with the question, okay, if this whole concept of grace in our relationship with God deals with so much of the dirt that we might do, should we just keep sinning so that grace abounds or increases even more to cover even more of the dirt that we do? And he's going to say, no, of course not. And in verses 1 through 2, that's literally what he is going to deal with as the question. No, you do not continue to sin so that grace will increase. On the other hand, he's going to use an illustration that comes from baptism in verses 3 through 11, saying that just as Christ died and was raised from the dead, baptism is a likeness unto that. Whereas much like we walk in the footsteps of Abraham that we saw back in chapter 4, our baptism likens us to our or his death and his resurrection. Saying that, one of the other themes we could have used for this chapter is the whole concept of newness, saying that now that we have been raised from the dead, like we said in chapter 5, the question is, if he was righteous in his life, what kind of life should we lead? And that is what he is going to clearly say is our responsibility. If we have been buried and raised with him in baptism, we should walk in newness of life, a biblical term that says we can't go back to doing the same things we were doing before if we want different results, the different results being an eternal peace with God. So he's going to say there are responsibilities that go along with accepting the free gift that we'll see toward the end. And if I didn't mention it, I want to title this chapter Free Gift or the Gift. Going on, though, in those verses 3 through 11, he is going to emphasize that point even more, saying if we were crucified with him, we were crucified so that we would no longer be enslaved to sin. Meaning, when those urges come calling, you're being developed into the kind of person that no longer has to respond to them every time they hit. God is planting within us the ability, within his spirit or the power of his spirit, to basically say no and not have to respond to the urges to fill in the blank, whatever it is that's dogged you over your life that you want to no longer be controlled by. Part of the benefit in a relationship with God is not just a heaven afar off, but the ability to no longer be controlled by the things that we once thought we were able to control as a source maybe of enjoyment or relief or escape from whatever problems we might have had. The things that we once think we're indulging as recreational activities, over time, you can realize how you lose control of them and they eventually control you. And that's part of the freedom that he is talking about. If we agree that the problems are problems and we allow him to help us no longer be controlled by the things that we once thought we had in check. Either way, bottom line is one of the things that goes along with no longer being controlled by things that bother our conscience or require us to turn our conscience off is no longer having to be dogged by the fear and anxiety of death. It doesn't mean that you are no longer reluctant to consider dying in certain ways, but it's likewise a process where just as he is freeing you from some things you might be embarrassed to know tempt you, you might be embarrassed for people to know that tempt you. Likewise, you can be free from the fear of suffering the consequences of those things, the biggest consequence being oftentimes death. And so he's promising freedom on two fronts: freedom from your urges and freedom from, in some ways, the anxiety that comes from realizing that death is something that we all have an appointment with. Understanding that, he is going to go on to say, therefore, consider yourselves dead to sin. Understanding that part of the freedom from being enslaved to shady ways is acknowledging that there are shady ways. One of the temptations that we can have when we are engaged in things that we are not quite proud of is to pretend like they're not wrong or that we're not doing them. And part of the freedom that he offers is the freedom to speak freely about the things that we have done wrong because we have embraced the fact that we need to put them in our past. And the more they are part of our past, the more we have, I think, the freedom to confess that, yeah, that's something I once did, but now I don't have to pretend like it's okay because I'm not controlled by it anymore. But as Jesus is going to say in one of his parables, as he's already said in one of his parables, when an evil spirit goes out of a person, it goes trying to find a new home, but finding none, comes back to its original host, and finding that place or that host swept clean. It says, oh, wait, there's not just room for me, but there's room for others. And bringing 7 spirits more wicked than itself, it re-enters that person. And the final condition of that individual indwelt by the 7 evil spirits is worse than the original condition, helping us to understand here how Paul is saying we have to replace those habits with something because we are going to serve somebody, as we often use the Bob Dylan illustration. It might be the devil or it might be the Lord, but you're going to have to serve somebody. And so in this chapter, Paul is helping us to understand, once again, we are not free agents. And so to the degree that God is helping us overcome some things that we might have been ashamed of in our past, he's saying, you have to replace it with something healthy or you're making yourself vulnerable for relapse. And so verses 12 through 14 are saying we have a responsibility to, if we're wise going forward in our healing, to make ourselves slaves or instruments of righteousness. Going back once again to the golden rule, making ourselves enslaved to that concept of needing to treat people the way that we want to be treated. And even more, as Jesus said in John chapter 13, as he was washing people's feet, trying to grow to a point where we're not simply content with parity, but we are considering ourselves more and more servants of others, meaning taking on the responsibility to help other people bear their burdens as opposed to being self-indulgent. Because if I go from self-indulgent to kicking a habit, but I never replace it with healthy habits, there's a chance that something else will come back in, appeal to my tendency to be self-indulgent, and make me self-indulgent in just a different way, bringing me back into the same problem in just a different form. And so he's saying the remedy for that is start practically doing for others in ways that you used to simply look out for yourselves or your favorites and not open your eyes to allow God to show you all those who might have a legitimate need that you can help out with. All that preachiness aside, though, verses 15 through 19 go into more detail about exactly that. We have to pick, but simply saying, I want to pick to be a less selfish person can leave you with guesswork as to how can I go about doing that? And so in verses 15 through 19, he's going to say, you got the choice. Either you're going to be enslaved to your own self-interest or obedience, which is the tool that God uses to counsel his people into effectively being of value to others beyond just themselves. And so if you listen to God, what he's trying to counsel us to do, it's like we often say, great counseling typically comes at a high price, but it loses its value if we don't put to work the things that the counselor, even the best counselors, are giving us in the way of advice that will actually improve our lives. And so likewise, one of the reasons why there is really no substitute for really trying to understand what God is trying to tell you to do is because he gives you a deeper wisdom as to how you can practically be a benefit to other people, as opposed to finding the frustration of what it's like to have the best of intentions only to find that you probably made more of a mess with your relationships or in your relationships with people, because as it says, the road to hell is paved with good intentions. And so our good intentions need to be met by godly wisdom that helps us understand what people actually need as opposed to what we simply think is best for them. And so when he says obedience leads to righteousness, obeying or taking his counsel seriously and putting it into practice is what actually makes us right or fair in our relationships with people. And that is what leads to sanctification, as verses 20 through 23 are going to say, to the degree you are embracing God in his role as counselor, that sanctification is what leads to what we heard about before in the previous chapter, eternal life. And so even though, as we mentioned at the outset, we have been justified past tense by the sacrifice that Christ made. Once again, just as in the last chapter, it said his life is what actually gives value or life to our own. He brings that back again as a point he's making in chapter 6, where he's saying we need to be likened to him in a death like his and his resurrection through baptism. But it's not just baptism. It is walking in newness of life. engaging in a process that leads from obedience to righteousness to sanctification that eventually leads to eternal life. Justification is cool, but it's not all that he's calling us to do, as the chapter will end up basically saying the wages of sin is death, going back to the illustration we had in chapter 2 of the savings account that all of our deeds are pouring into. He's going to say the free gift of God is eternal life. And like we said, there are two illustrations. He does talk about free gifts. Sometimes the sacrifice of the Christ is described as a gift of God. And here he's describing eternal life as a gift of God. But going back to the beginning of the chapter, once again, one of the reasons why we could have entitled it newness as opposed to gift is because he's saying it's not enough to simply say, thanks, Jesus, and be satisfied with justification. There's a process that we have to embrace, much like, once again, walking in the footsteps of faith like Abraham did now and walking in newness of life. There's a process by which God, by the time we get to chapter 12, will say he transforms us into the kind of people he actually wants to be around forever, thus eternal life. And since this one is already too long by my estimation, I might as well throw in the illustration that came to mind when the concept of free gift kind of stepped forward as a title, and that is somebody can give me something nice like a house or a car, but if I neglect that gift, it loses value over time. Why? Because you know that those things require maintenance, and I can only ignore or neglect the necessary maintenance on nice stuff for so long before it either depreciates or stops working altogether. And so, beyond Romans 12, it talks about the process by which we are being transformed into the kind of people God actually wants to be around forever. The Hebrew writer in chapter 2 is going to ask, how are we going to escape if we neglect so great a salvation? Once again, pointing back to chapters like this that help us to understand that being justified or having been justified is great, but we can neglect that gift if we do not decide to embrace the grind that goes along with sanctification.